Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade.
We chronicled the distinct memories of our childhood in our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, which takes you on a notably historic journey through that often forgotten decade. We also want to hear about your experiences during the 1950s. We will feature guests whose special stories of that decade will bring to mind magical moments of reflection, some with tears, some with smiles, but above all, a good dose of laughter.
We would like you to chat with us as we bring to mind the sights and sounds so familiar to that time in history. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello, thanks for being our guest today, whether you're returning or whether you're a new guest. We are delighted to have you join the 1950s Fun Chat. We know that the experiences that will be shared today about life in the 50s will broaden your knowledge about that decade, and maybe it'll even tickle some memories that you have of that decade or that someone has shared with you about that decade. Jackie, what's happening with our Fun Chat program today?
Well, today we'll start out by saying hi, viewers, and we'd like to have you peruse the screen. And you'll notice, first of all, that on the bottom, you'll see www.whilethewindmillwatch.com and the banner that's going across the bottom. We would like to have you check that out that site. It has a lot of information about the book and about the authors and about this 1950s Fun Chat. Also, take a look up in the upper right-hand corner. You'll see the cover of our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s. You'll also notice on the book, there's a little white spot on the lower right-hand corner, and that is a very special medal that we won earlier this year. The book won. It's the 2022 Independent Press Award for Distinguished Favorite in the category of Regional Nonfiction. So we are very pleased to have been awarded this. Hopefully it's only the first one of our many awards that will come. You'll also notice the windmill silhouetted and looking over the two little girls. And that is a theme that goes throughout the book. So without further ado, as they say, I'm going to introduce you to our guest. His name is Fred Knop. And Fred grew up in the 1950s in a third-generation farm family noted for raising high-quality horned Hereford cattle near Atlantic, Iowa. He notes that he was, quote, born to farm, unquote. From the time he could carry a small bucket, he was feeding livestock. Fred earned a degree in animal science at Iowa State University. After graduation, he married the love of his life, North Dakotan Janine Pfeiffer. You may recognize who that person is. Janine and Fred farmed together over 4 decades, having raised corn, soybeans, small grains, and hay. Along with their 2 daughters, Brittany and Louise, they also bred and raised award-winning sheep. In their daughters' combined 12-year tenure in 4-H and FFA membership, their market lambs garnered championships at many major livestock shows across the United States. So welcome, Fred. We're so glad that you decided to sit down and chat with us today.
Yes.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So I know you said earlier that you were born to farm. So would you mind telling us, please, of some of your earliest memories of your farm life?
Well, to go way back to age 1 through 3, it's a period of time, of course, I do not recall, but my folks lived on a farm which they rented down by Morton Mills, Iowa, approximately 20 miles south of our current location, straight down Highway 71, be a little closer to Missouri. Mm-hmm. I recall my parents having very good memories of the Morton Mills farm, great neighbors that they would talk about even at later dates as in family conversation. I recall that evidently there was a hill involved in one particular farm field east of the house that I recall my mother and recounting the story that she and Dad would take bushel baskets and crawl on their hands and knees to pick up cuckleburr seeds so that they would not go to seed and make more obvious cuckleburrs in the upcoming crop. And, that's just the type of work that people did back in those days, because that was ahead of the time of pesticides and herbicides. And if there was a weed in a field, it was removed by hand or perhaps a cultivator. I remember the folks talking about Saturday nights down in when they're at Morton Mills. And of course, everybody at that time milked a few cows, and you had some pigs and some sows and some cattle and probably a few cows and the folks and some chickens. Obviously, the folks said that they would sell their eggs and their cream to the local vendor there in Morton Mills. And if they had any money left, which they would be thankful for, they would go to the movies in Villisca. So that was kind of the what I recall down in Morton Mills.
And how far away was Villisca from Morton Mills?
I would estimate about another 10 miles south.
Okay, so they had one vehicle then, a car?
To my knowledge, it was just a car, yes.
Okay, all right. Yes, it'd be interesting to know what some of those movies were that they saw in that decade.
Certainly would, but I bet Clark Gable may have been in them.
Yes, probably.
Of course,
probably,
yes.
probably. And then were they in card groups? Because I know in that era with a small farming community, a card group became a popular way of communication and socializing in the community.
I believe that would be correct in that the folks may have been involved in a pinochle group in the area there.
Okay.
And then after life at Morton Mills for those first 3 years, then what happened?
Well, the folks had an opportunity then to move north on Highway 71 to the home farm, or what we call the Century Farm. And that's a very extremely high quality farm located about 1.5 miles south of Atlantic, still on Highway 71. And that's where I grew up, and probably most of my memories have occurred is through the Century Farm and the various avenues of livestock production and crop production that entailed on that farm.
So, Fred, would you mind telling us what a Century Farm means? What?
Century Farm means that it's an award that's given at the Iowa State Fair every year to farms that qualify, but it's farms that have been in the ownership of one particular family, in our case, the Knop family, for over 100 years.
I see.
Do you
Quite an
remember?
accomplishment.
Do you remember who originally purchased that piece of ground south of Atlantic?
Without going back into the abstracts, I believe it was perhaps William Knop.
And would he have been your great-great-grandfather? Or what would have been the relationship?
Probably great-grandfather. I guess I'd have to do the math on that.
Okay, all right. But then your grandfather, Otto Knop, lived there for a number of years before your parents moved there. Is that correct?
That would be correct. And then at the time my folks moved up the road, there was an opportunity to purchase an 80-acre farm on the west side of the highway. And my grandparents, Otto and Mary, and Lena Knop, then moved to a house they built on that property and lived there. And of course, that's part of the memories of childhood too, having grandparents right across the road, I spent a lot of time with my granddad Knop.
And many people will probably remember that house if they lived in this area or traveled US Highway 71, because it was very distinguishable as it was painted red. And it was the
That's right.
little red house that was right off on the west side of Highway 71. And it was there for years.
For years, and it became kind of a landmark and very easy for us to give directions to our farm.
Yes, yes.
So, Fred, on a farm, there's always a lot of work. But can you give us a little hint about what there was under the umbrella of play? Play on the farm.
Well, as a young farm boy with a big world out there, you can imagine that someone with some imagination and some desire to explore and see what the world's all about. That's what my life was as a youngster. You know, my mother tells a story. This would have been somewhere in the middle 50s that Highway 71 was redone by road construction people. Well, there were big yellow turnipoles, which are earth-moving devices, machines, working the road constantly. And the folks said they had to put a fence up around the yard to keep me from wanting to get right close to those turnipoles. And I would just watch them for hours on end. I guess that was the science in me, watching the construction of a road. And then lo and behold, I don't know if it was a birthday or a Christmas gift, I ended up with my own personal turnipole. And I think I moved the dirt on the farm probably twice over. It's
Cool.
Yes.
Do you happen to still have that?
I actually have it. It's downstairs in the basement of the house that Janine and I currently live in.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And I'm proud to say that it's still in operational condition.
Yes. And I'm a thrower and I haven't touched it. I leave it alone.
You're a smart gal, yes.
Yeah, I recognize that trait, Janine, after almost 50 years of being together. So I have definitely kept a close eye on that turnipole.
Well, I know you have shared stories with me too, in our family about growing up on that farm, that site, and you loved rocks. Tell us about rocks and how they tie in with Highway 71 and just your fascination with rocks.
Well, there's a little bit of a touchy subject, but
Oh dear.
I guess deep down, I always wanted to be a baseball pitcher.
Oh.
And to do that, you need to practice your throwing skills. Now, I could throw a baseball pretty well, but what I was really good at was throwing rocks. And it got to the point that my Uncle Don and Uncle Sonny tell the story that they were afraid to drive up my parents' driveway to our farm for fear that I'd be hiding in the bushes throwing rocks at them.
Yeah.
And then I do recall probably when my rock throwing career ended, it was very traumatic. There were some large pine trees out near the highway, and some smaller conifer trees planted in between the large trees. Just the right size that 5, 6, 7-year-old my size could hide behind the trees with a little passel full of rocks. Well, and then as trucks would go by, I would practice. Of course, you know, they're going down the highway. You would have to what's called leading your the position that, of course, you would anticipate your rock to take. And the idea was to hit the truck.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't hit the truck very often, except one time a relatively large semi, and I must have led that thing just right. And that rock hit the side of that semi with a large boom. And the air brakes of the semi went on immediately. And as a youngster, you can imagine I panicked. And if there were records for the 100-yard dash for an 8-year-old, I probably would be right at the top of the list. And that's about the end of my rock throwing.
And
you
so,
always-
do you mind say what happened to that? Did your father or mother intervene, or did the truck driver come back, or what?
Thankfully, the truck driver went on down the road.
Okay.
I was just about having a heart attack over that deal.
Yeah.
And as far as my parents, they knew about Uncle Don and Sonny, and of course, I'm sure that I was disciplined on that deal. But when you're young, you got to try these things and see how they work out.
Well, didn't you also throw some rocks at your sisters?
Only when they needed education.
Yes,
Needed it.
right.
So that was only occasionally. And of course, that didn't go over very well.
No.
Well, I know we had Sheppies. Our dogs were always named Sheppy on our farm. And you had a Sheppy also. You had many Sheppies, but I think there's a particular story about a neighbor boy and Sheppy that you might want to share with our viewers today.
Well, I also had an interest in basketball. So Dad constructed a pole with a basketball hoop out west of the house and in a small pasture and up in kind of a level spot by some big pine trees. And gosh, we spent hours and hours and hours out there shooting baskets. Just as an aside, I remember playing basketball in junior high, 7th grade. At the end of the season, the coach brought us together and kind of individually spoke to the players and what his expectations were for them in terms of preparation for the next season to do during the summer and et cetera. And he came to me and he says, Fred, he says, I actually think you have a pretty good opportunity to play some ball for us. But he says, I just would encourage you to go home and practice and do the things that we prescribe that you could be a successful basketball player. And I remember telling the coach, Mr. Allen, at that time that I probably wouldn't be participating in the activities he prescribed because I had some steers to show and I needed to spend my time with my cattle.
Yeah.
But back at the basketball court when we were a youngster, the neighbor boy, Doug Shirley, who lived the first house north of us, who was about a year older than I, also enjoyed basketball. So Doug would come down and we would enjoy a afternoon or a couple hours of playing basketball one-on-one with each other. Doug was bigger and taller and actually more skilled at basketball than I. So he would usually win, but we'd play horse and that worked out pretty well in my favor sometimes, but we just had fun together. Well, one time Doug was to come down and meet out at the court where we always did. And I was out there shooting baskets, getting ready to shoot baskets, and Doug wasn't there. But I could hear this faint, help, help. And I looked around and I couldn't see anybody. But Sheppy had proceeded going out to the court with me. And Sheppy was a kind of a part German Shepherd Collie, but had a lot of guarding instinct in her. And she, before I got out there, she saw Doug, who was actually coming to the court before I was to arrive. And Doug was frightened of Sheppy and was up a tree. and was looking for a little help to call the dog off so he could get down. Then we could play basketball.
Well, I know in our days when we wanted to holler for a friend, or even with Jackie and I hollered, there was a certain slogan, certain message that we would holler. What did you holler, Fred, to Doug, to make him aware across the road that you were ready to play?
Yeah, well, I hate to give out our secrets even at this time, but it was
Only a few
Kia.
hundred.
Don't tell anybody, but it was Kia Key.
Didn't we say that?
Yes.
Yeah. No.
We must have gotten it from a TV show.
I wonder if
I think that's where, yeah.
The Lone Ranger or Roy Rogers. Maybe if any of our viewers have an idea on that. Did you say Kia Key also? We'd love to hear from you. Just put a note in the comments below and or comment where you first heard it as well, because it was evidently the call of the generation, the kids of that generation.
And it was not original, obviously. It was Kia Key.
Yep. That's right. Well, Fred, I know that you had special memories with your grandpa and grandma Knop because you loved trains. Can you tell us about those special memories with your grandpa and grandma Knop?
It was trains, I guess you could say, have been something I have been extremely fascinated with my entire life. I do not recall this specifically, only coming through the stories from my grandparents, but my granddad and grandma Knop had a 1950 black Buick, wonderful car, and always kept it shined up. Omaha was about 60 miles one way, so it'd be a 120-mile round trip. And back in those days, you just didn't take a 120-mile round trip because it cost quite a bit of money to travel, of course. Mm-hmm. But my grandparents evidently thought a lot of me. I very much appreciate that, even to this day. The story goes, they would put me in the back of the black 1950 Buick, go to Omaha, where you could drive right up close to the Union Pacific Railroad tracks. And of course, at that time, just full of trains and switching of cars and trains going here and trains going there and different shapes and sizes of boxcars. And as the story goes, that I would stand in the back seat, looking out the back window, and it would the exclamation that would come from me, I guess, repeatedly was "big choo-choo train." And evidently, that phrase and my joy of my grandparents recognizing that was enough to warrant a 120-mile round trip occasionally to see the big choo-choo trains.
Do you remember, if maybe not because you were so young, doing anything else while you were in the city? Did your grandma go shopping at Brandeis? Or
well, yes, that was a big thing. Back then, Brandeis was the department store with multiple levels and elevators that had men and women that actually operated the elevator. And shopping at Brandeis was a special event. In the Brandeis basement was a cafeteria that was well known, and everything was purchased a la carte, and we would thoroughly enjoy the opportunity to occasionally have a meal there as a family.
Mm-hmm. And what an opportunity to learn good table manners and put your best foot forward. What a great training time, as well as a wonderful time to get to know your grandparents and them to get to know you.
Oh, so, absolutely.
Fred, you also love to play by the creek. And we have had a lot of guests who grew up on farms and who were near the creek. And we say creek, some people say crick, but anyway, and you had lots of fun there. Can you share some of those times that you were exploring in that creek area?
Well, I had read quite a bit about dams in encyclopedias and various other scientific books that I enjoyed reading in very much. And so I would go down to these streams. We had one right by the highway south of the house, and another one about halfway through the farm going to the east. And at that time, they were smaller streams than they are today. Janine, you'd have to kind of visualize smaller and
Okay.
narrower flows of water. But it was to the point I could get it down there on my hands and knees and had my overshoes on, and I'd build these dams that would back up water clear to the highway. It was amazing. And it was also really interesting. Then when you cut off the flow of water going downstream in the dam, you could explore the stream bed and find lots of times minnows or crawdads and just all the things that fascinated a young boy my age.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. And tromping through the woods. You have talked about that to me many different times. What did that involve?
That was a phrase that we would hear from my granddad mass teller, who was very much an outdoors person and very much had a working knowledge of and a particular desire and enjoyed going out in what you would call the timber, and just strolling in an afternoon, observing the life that was in that timber, be it a squirrel, be it maybe a new kind of bird that he had not seen before, maybe rabbits, he called it tromping in the woods.
Okay.
And it was just kind of a time of enjoyment and a time of learning. And I enjoyed also doing what was called tromping in the woods.
Mm-hmm.
So, Fred, you lived in the country. Did you also get your education in the country?
Yes.
Okay.
Right south of our Century Farm, the home farm where I grew up then, was the country school Grove number 5. And there were 3 boys or 3 of us in my class, all boys, myself, Hiram Lewin, and Scott Hockenberry. I mentioned their names with a little tug in my heart, doggone it, because both Scott and Hiram have passed away at the time of this podcast here. But we learned a lot together as a threesome in country school. We had a wonderful teacher. Her name was Mrs. Samish. I believe her husband had passed away, but she was an awesome school teacher. We had students through 6th grade at country school. I was fortunate enough to attend country school through 4th grade and then moved to Atlantic to start 5th grade at Lincoln School.
So then were the country schools starting to close in about 1958 and children then were bused into a larger school?
I believe so. The details of that really escaped me, but I wasn't really aware at the time of the details of moving from country school to town school. We just knew that was going to happen. But I think you're right. I think that's about the time those country schools started closing. But there are so many good things at country school that we enjoyed, particularly recess. That was a great time. We have 2 recesses a day.
Yeah.
And in my class with Scott and Hiram, we would wrestle. And the reason we would wrestle is to determine who was going to be the leader of our little threesome. And majority of the time it was myself. And so therefore I earned the coveted title of strong boy number one.
Yeah.
Good.
So that's how it went in country school.
Okay.
Did the title
having
move
earned that,
around?
yeah, having earned that title, did you keep it for a long time, or were the other classmates scared of you, or how did that work as you being strong boy number one?
Once I was strong boy number one, there was no questions to be asked later.
And you were a little sport too.
Pardon me?
Weren't you pretty small in stature in that time of your life?
Well, yeah, but pretty darn scrappy.
Okay.
And, you know, and at that time I was carrying small buckets of feed and eggs and
Yeah.
doing all kinds of things. So we were active.
And strong.
Tell us about your love for reading.
Oh, it was wonderful. In our house, one of the additions to the house was the south porch. And in the porch had a lot of windows, wonderfully warm spot to be in the wintertime with the south sun shining through the windows. And we had a couple bookcases out there, one of which contained the World Book encyclopedias. And there was very few things I enjoyed more than sitting down and just reading, and maybe even more than reading, just absorbing the information that was in those encyclopedias. It was a whole new world for me.
Did you have favorite subject areas to look at in those red World Book encyclopedias?
Well, anything scientific would catch my mind.
Okay.
And we'd have to go from there.
And then I believe that in country school you also enjoyed singing, and there's a special remembrance of that I'd like you to share, please.
Well, if I reach over here, I'll show you.
Sure.
I don't know if you can see this.
Move it there we go.
There we sing.
This is the songbook. In fact, probably my personal copy of the songbook from country school. And I can tell you to this day, the page that my favorite all-time song is on in this book. It was on page 210, and it's the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Can you open that front cover and show us your signature, your printed signature? I remember when you got that book, when your mom gave you that book. Oh my gosh, you were so elated to have it. Move it up. Yeah. Can you move? There we go.
Frederick.
Yes. And Mrs. Samish always called you Frederick, didn't she? Rather than Fred?
I believe so. And I think I was called Frederick a lot of times when there was maybe a little discipline in the air.
Yeah. Was that often?
We won't talk about that.
Okay. Moving on, huh?
But you can tell by my printing that my penmanship was probably something that lacked in terms of ability, and I can tell you even at this date it's not improved.
Well, but you have all that information in your head. You don't need to have it in your fingers, huh?
Yeah, there you go.
Mr. Morrow at that time was the Cass County, Iowa Superintendent of Schools. And there's a special remembrance that you have of him. Can you share that with us, please?
Well, it's kind of I guess I did participate in it, but I remember my mother recanting this story occasionally. But I guess as I understand it, of course, at that time you would take once a year, I believe it was, basic skills. And that was to determine, I guess, your scholastic abilities and your reading levels and levels of computation, etc. Well, we would take basic skills, and I personally wouldn't really think too much about it. But one day, Mr. Morrow showed up at school, and kids all knew who he was, but we really didn't have much contact with him. He would come out and talk with Mrs. Samish. So one day he was out and had a little discussion with Mrs. Samish, and then they called me into the room. I thought, oh boy, here we go.
What
This may not be good.
Strong boy number one.
Yeah, right. Anyway, they informed me that I had done very well on the basic skills, and even the gravity of that didn't fall upon me too much. But my mother would tell me from that the content of that particular conversation was that I had done, I guess, well enough in the basic skills that they couldn't even graph me. And the discussion was just what they were going to do with me, I guess.
Off the charts.
Anyway, that's my remembrance of basic skills.
Do you recall if there were any special assignments that you had that would keep you more occupied or related more to your abilities then?
Maybe not. Other than that, perhaps you were given additional work to do, like you might be talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We had a lot of fun at recess at country schools to get off the serious matter of scholastics. There was a dirt road right north of the country school.
Uh-huh.
And in the wintertime, boy, they would get sometimes perfect ice and perfect snow conditions. So it'd be great for sleigh riding. And at that time, we were permitted during recess to go out on the dirt road and sleigh ride. So there'd be kids all over that road, some walking up the road pulling their sleds, some sliding down with their sleds, and sometimes you could go pretty darn fast. It's a tragic thing. I remember I had a wonderful sled. It was really fast.
Was it a radio flyer?
It was, but it was one of the really old ones.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the younger boys in our school was, for some reason, walking backwards up the hill, pulling his sled on the country road right in the middle of the road. Well, sometimes you're going fast enough, you cannot control, particularly in icy conditions, the pathway of that sled. And I recall to this day going right underneath that young guy, upending him, and I think he kind of conked his head when he hit the roadbed. And in this day, we would probably think it would be a concussion. In those days, we just got over it and went on.
Yes.
Wow.
Fred, we are nearing the end of our broadcast there, and I'd like to ask you just one question at this time, because I do think we will continue with another broadcast at another time, because there's so much more information that you have shared with us you'd like to tell, and we would love to hear that story. What was a fun memory that just comes to mind that occurred in the 1950s in your life?
Oh, it'd be a couple. Probably having the ability that my grandparents took me to look at trains. And then I loved playing in the dirt with that turnip pole. That was something I really enjoyed doing. And of course, as the only boy in a family, you had to make your own fun back in those days. And so that's what we did.
Okay.
And I
All
remember
right.
we had a sand pile right north of this main sidewalk, and right north of my mom's, a row of red Uten roses that were beautiful. And I would spend hours and hours and hours at that sand pile, hauling sand and constructing whatever I could in my mind visualize at that time.
Mhm.
And just wonderful, wonderful memories.
Creative play was
Yeah.
so available to you then, wasn't it?
Yes, well, it's what you made of it, you bet.
Mhm, mhm.
Yes. Viewers, we want you to recognize that our guest today is my husband, Fred Knop, who was born, lived his whole life in that decade of the 1950s and has shared memories from that special time. We also want you to recognize that when we have these 19 Fun Chat broadcasts, we are so delighted to have each and every guest on who tell his or her story, because not only does it give us as viewers and as interviewers the opportunity to learn about the 1950s and how each one's life was different, but it also becomes a treasured broadcast recording for your family. And we hope that it becomes cherished for you as the listener and for your family. So remember to like these broadcasts and subscribe to our channel. We just would love to have you do that, because we're telling the story. We're telling history, right, Jackie? And it's live. Yep, from people who lived it. So
Correct.
yep. So until next time, folks, we just hope you remember the 1950s, maybe things from the 50s, such as the malt shops, cool cars. In Fred's case, creative play and learning all about life because of those opportunities of creative play and the value of having an extended family to be close to and to learn from. So until next time, we thank you for viewing, and we'll see you then.
Toodaloo.
Jackie? Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.